Teacher mocks poor girl, faints when she sees who the girl's father is. The morning sun barely peeked through the curtains as Emma Garcia stood in front of her mirror, tugging nervously at her plain, white collar. Her new uniform felt stiff and uncomfortable, nothing like the worn but soft clothes she usually wore. She ran her fingers through her dark hair one more time, trying to make the drugstore hair clips look as neat as possible. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. In the kitchen, her mother Sophia was already up, making breakfast despite having worked a late shift at the diner the night before. The smell of eggs and toast filled their small apartment, mixing with the familiar scent of coffee that seemed to follow her mother everywhere. "Mama, maybe I should just go to Washington Public instead," Emma said quietly, picking at her breakfast. "It's free, and all my friends from the neighborhood go there." Sophia paused from packing Emma's lunch, dark circles visible under her eyes. "Mi amor, we've talked about this. Riverside Prep is one of the best schools in the city. This is the opportunity one never had." She smiled, though Emma could see the worry lines around her eyes. "Besides, we're not giving up before you even start, right?" Emma nodded, trying to mirror her mother's brave face. She knew how hard her mom had worked for this, the extra shifts, the careful budgeting, the endless paperwork for financial aid. For 3 years, Sophia had put aside every spare dollar, determined to give her daughter the education she deserved. The bus ride to Riverside Prep felt like entering another world. As they got closer to the school, Emma watched the neighborhoods change. Small apartments and corner stores gave way to large houses with perfectly trimmed lawns. Her stomach twisted as the bus pulled up to the impressive brick building with its manicured gardens and stone columns. Students streamed past her, their shoes shiny and new, their backpacks bearing expensive brand names. Emma clutched her plain canvas bag closer, suddenly very aware of the small scuff on her secondhand shoes. She tried to clean them the night before, but the mark wouldn't come out. The hallways buzzed with activity as kids reunited after summer break. Emma noticed how they moved in groups, laughing and sharing stories about vacations to places she'd only seen in movies. She checked her schedule again, looking for room 203, Ms. Vance's classroom. The room wasn't hard to find, but stepping inside felt like crossing an invisible barrier. The other students were already settling in, their confidence obvious in the way they chose their seats and chatted with each other. Emma hesitated in the doorway, scanning for an empty spot that wouldn't draw too much attention. Ms. Vance stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding immediate respect. She was tall and elegant, with perfectly styled gray hair and clothes that probably cost more than Sophia, made in a month. Her eyes swept over the class with practiced authority, pausing briefly on Emma with an expression that made the girl's chest tighten. "Please take your seats quickly," Ms. Vance announced, her voice crisp and formal. "We have a full day ahead, and I expect nothing less than excellence from my students." Emma slid into an empty desk near the back, trying to make herself as small as possible. She carefully arranged her new notebooks and pencils, basic supplies from the dollar store that seemed shabby compared to the leather-bound planners and expensive pens her classmates were pulling out. The morning began with introductions, each student standing to share their name and something about their summer. Emma's heart raced as she listened to stories about European vacations, summer homes, and private tennis lessons. When it was her turn, she stood on shaky legs. "I'm Emma Garcia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This summer I help my mom at work sometimes and read a lot of books from the library." The silence that followed felt heavy. Ms. Vance's eyebrow arched slightly, and a few students exchanged glances. Emma quickly sat down, her face burning. She could hear a couple of girls giggling behind their hands, though she couldn't tell if it was about her or something else entirely. "Well," Ms. Vance said, her tone carrying a hint of dismissal, "let's move on to our first activity of the year. I like to assess where my students stand academically right from the start." She began dividing the class into groups, calling out names with practiced efficiency. Emma waited, her hope rising each time Ms. Vance started listing new names. But as the groups filled up and students began moving their desks together, Emma remained at her seat, untouched by the assignments. Finally, when everyone else was settled, Ms. Vance turned her attention to Emma. "Miss Garcia," she said, emphasizing the name in a way that made it sound foreign, "perhaps you should observe today's activity. After all, you might find our curriculum challenging." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed on your first day." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. A few students snickered, and Emma felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak up, to say she could handle any work they gave her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded silently, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. As the other students worked together, their voices mixing in excited chatter, Emma sat alone. She watched them solve problems and share ideas, feeling like a ghost in her own classroom. Ms. Vance walked between the groups, offering praise and guidance, but never once glanced in Emma's direction. Emma pulled out her notebook and began taking careful notes on what she observed, determined to learn something even if she couldn't participate. Her mom's voice echoed in her head, "You're just as smart as any of them, Mihija. Don't let anyone make you think different." The morning dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When the lunch bell finally rang, Emma almost cried with relief. She grabbed her paper bag lunch and headed for the door, but Ms. Vance's voice stopped her. "Miss Garcia, a moment, please." Emma turned back, her heart pounding. Ms. Vance was arranging papers on her desk, not looking up as she spoke. "I hope you understand that Riverside Prep maintains very high standards. Not everyone is suited for our environment." She finally met Emma's eyes. "It would be completely understandable if you found another school more appropriate for your capabilities." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She thought of her mother's tired smile, of the extra hours she worked, of the pride in her voice when she told their neighbors her daughter was going to Riverside Prep. "I understand the standards, Ms. Vance," Emma said quietly but firmly. "And I'm going to meet them." She walked out of the classroom before Ms. Vance could respond, her chin held high even as her hands trembled. In the hallway, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. It was only the first day, she reminded herself. She had worked too hard to get here, and her mother had sacrificed too much for her to give up now. The cafeteria buzzed with activity as Emma found an empty table in the corner. She unpacked her lunch, a simple sandwich and an apple, and pulled out a book to read. Around her, students gathered in groups, their designer lunch bags filled with foods she couldn't name. But Emma focused on her book, losing herself in its pages, finding strength in the stories of other people who had faced their own challenges and emerged stronger. As the first day drew to a close, Emma gathered her things, already planning how she would study harder, prepare better, prove herself worthy of her place in this school. She might not have the right clothes or the expensive supplies, but she had something else, determination that burned brighter with every obstacle placed in her way. The next few weeks at Riverside Prep felt like walking through a maze where the walls kept shifting. Emma developed a routine: arrive early, sit quietly, and try to blend into the background, though that last part proved impossible under Ms. Vance's watchful eye. Every morning, Emma woke up an hour earlier than necessary to review her assignments one more time. She'd spread her books across their small kitchen table while Sophia got ready for work, double-checking every answer, making sure her handwriting was perfect. There couldn't be any mistakes, not when Ms. Vance seemed to be waiting for them. "You're going to burn yourself out, mi amor," Sophia would say, placing a cup of hot chocolate next to Emma's books. But they both knew Emma couldn't afford to slow down. In class, Emma's hand shot up for every question. She'd studied the material so thoroughly, she could probably recite the textbooks from memory. But Ms. Vance had a talent for making her feel small, even when she gave the right answer. "Correct, Miss Garcia," she'd say with a slight sigh, as if Emma's success was somehow inconvenient. Though perhaps we could hear from someone else for a change? Someone with a different perspective? The other students picked up on Ms. Vance's cues. During group assignments, they'd shuffle their desks together quickly, forming tight circles that somehow never had space for one more. Emma learned to recognize the awkward glances and mumbled excuses. "Sorry, we already have 5 people. Maybe next time." We kind of already planned our group. One girl, Sarah, occasionally smiled at Emma in the hallways when no one else was looking. But in class, she kept her distance like everyone else. Emma understood. Being nice to her meant risking Ms. Vance's disapproval, and no one wanted that. The library became Emma's sanctuary during lunch breaks. Between its tall shelves, surrounded by books, she could pretend she was somewhere else entirely. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, noticed her regular presence and started recommending books. She never asked why Emma spent every lunch period there instead of in the cafeteria, and Emma was grateful for that. "Have you read this one, Mrs. Chun?" "Just thinking about something." The librarian's kind eyes crinkled with understanding. "Sometimes thinking too much can make mountains out of molehills. Want to help me sort these new arrivals? It might help clear your head." Grateful for the distraction, Emma spent her lunch hour helping Mrs. Chin catalog books. The familiar routine of checking spines and organizing shelves calmed her nerves, but the worry lingered like a shadow. That evening, Emma waited until after dinner to show Sophia the notice. They were sitting at their small kitchen table, Sophia still in her diner uniform, sipping coffee while Emma cleared the dishes. "Mama," Emma started hesitantly, pulling the crumpled paper from her backpack. "There's this thing at school next week." Sophia took the notice, her eyes scanning the page. Emma watched her mother's expression change, saw the slight tightening around her mouth that meant she was worried about money. "It's mandatory?" Sophia asked, looking up. Emma nodded, then rushed to add, "But maybe I could tell them you're sick, or dash." "No," Sophia interrupted firmly. "No lies, Mia Moore. We don't hide, remember?" She studied the notice again. "I'll talk to Jerry about switching shifts." "But you need those hours," Emma protested. "And Ms. Vance isn't even going to show my work. She only picks the exemplary students." She tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice, but some slipped through. Sophia was quiet for a moment, then got up and went to her bedroom. She returned with a small, worn envelope. "I wasn't sure when to show you this," she said, sitting back down. "It came last week." Emma recognized the handwriting immediately, though she'd only seen it a few times before. Her father's elegant script covered the envelope, addressing it to her mother. "He asks about you," Sophia said softly. "More often lately. I told him about the school, about how hard you're working, and about—" She hesitated. "About some of the challenges." Emma's chest tightened. "You told him about Ms. Vance?" Sophia nodded. "He should know what his daughter faces, and how brave she is facing it." She slid a folded paper across the table. He wrote back. With trembling fingers, Emma opened the letter. The message was brief, but the words made her heart race. "I'll be there. Tell Emma to be ready." "But he never comes," Emma whispered. Her father's absence had been a constant in her life, marked by occasional phone calls and birthday cards with checks inside. "Why now?" Sophia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Because now you need him. And maybe he needs to see you too, see the amazing young woman you're becoming." That night, Emma lay in bed, unable to sleep. She thought about her father coming to Parents' Day, about Ms. Vance's reaction, about all the perfectly polished parents who would be there. Would he fit in? Would he be embarrassed by her? The questions chased each other around her mind until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Ms. Vance had the class practicing their presentations, but only the chosen few would actually perform. Emma watched as Sarah rehearsed her speech about the solar system, complete with a detailed model her parents had helped her build. Even Sarah seemed different now, caught up in the excitement of the upcoming event, too busy to offer even her usual secret smile. One afternoon, Ms. Vance held Emma back after class. "Miss Garcia," she said, arranging papers on her desk without looking up. "About Parents' Day?" Emma's heart jumped. Was Ms. Vance going to include her work after all? "I understand if your mother's schedule makes it difficult to attend," Ms. Vance continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We could make an exception in your case. After all, we wouldn't want to cause any hardship." The words hit Emma like a slap. She thought of her father's letter, tucked safely in her notebook. "My family will be here," she said quietly but firmly. Ms. Vance finally looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Oh, both parents?" Her tone made it clear she didn't believe it. "Yes," Emma replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Both of them." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ms. Vance's face, but she recovered quickly. "Well," she said, shuffling her papers again, "how nice. Though perhaps next year someone can be here for you." The dismissal in her voice was clear. Emma walked out of the classroom, her head high despite the burning in her cheeks. In her backpack, her father's letter seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. She hadn't seen him in years. Would he really come? And if he did, would it make any difference? That evening, Emma helped her mother iron her best dress for Parents' Day. The fabric was a little worn at the seams, but Sophia had always taken good care of it. "What if he doesn't come?" Emma asked suddenly, smoothing a wrinkle with trembling hands. Sophia paused, looking at her daughter. "Then we face it together, like we always do." She took the iron from Emma's hands. "But he'll come. He may have been absent before, but when it really matters." She smiled. "Your father keeps his promises." The night before Parents' Day, Emma couldn't sleep. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, was her father preparing to come see her? Would he be proud of her? Or would he see what Ms. Vance saw, a girl who didn't quite belong? She pulled out her notebook and began writing, not a presentation or a speech, but a letter to herself. In it, she poured out all her fears and hopes, all the words she wished she could say to Ms. Vance, to her classmates, to her father. By the time she finished, the sky was beginning to lighten, and she felt somehow lighter too. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had gotten her this far. She was Emma Garcia, daughter of Sophia, who worked double shifts to give her daughter a better life, and of a father who had written, "I'll be there when she needed him most." As she finally drifted off to sleep, Emma thought she understood something new about belonging. Maybe it wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of who you should be. Maybe it was about being strong enough to be yourself, and finding the people who saw your worth without needing to be convinced. Parents' Day dawned bright and clear, the kind of autumn morning that made Riverside Prep's brick buildings glow like copper. Emma stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her uniform for the 10th time. Sophia had ironed it perfectly the night before, and the crisp pleats of her skirt felt like armor. The classroom was transformed when they arrived. Display boards showcased carefully selected student work, and fresh flowers sat in vases on Ms. Vance's desk. Parents in expensive suits and designer dresses filled the room, creating a soft buzz of important-sounding conversations. Ms. Vance floated between groups, her gray hair perfectly styled and her outfit clearly chosen to impress. She stopped to chat with a man Emma recognized as the CEO of a local tech company, Sarah's father. "Oh, Mr. Peterson, Sarah's solar system project was simply outstanding. Such attention to detail." Emma and Sophia found seats near the back. Sophia had managed to get her diner uniform perfectly clean and pressed, but Emma could see how out of place her mother felt among the other parents. Still, Sophia sat with her back straight, dignity in every line of her posture. "He'll come," Sophia whispered, squeezing Emma's hand. But as more parents filtered in and the seats filled up, Emma felt her hope starting to fade. Ms. Vance began her presentation, her voice carrying that special tone she reserved for important visitors. "At Riverside Prep, we pride ourselves on nurturing excellence," she announced, gesturing to the display boards. "As you can see from these selected works, our students consistently exceed expectations." Emma's eyes wandered to the displays, noting how none of her assignments had made the cut. Even her history project about Dolores Huerta, which had earned an A, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the boards showcased work from students whose parents sat in the front rows, their expressions proud and knowing. The door at the back of the classroom opened quietly, and Emma's heart stopped. A man in a perfectly tailored suit slipped in, his presence immediately drawing attention despite his attempt at discretion. Emma felt her mother stiffen beside her, and several parents turned to look. The man stood quietly at the back, his eyes scanning the room until they found Emma. When their gazes met, his face softened into a smile that made her chest ache with recognition. He looked older than in the photos she had, with touches of gray at his temples, but his eyes were exactly as she remembered, warm and intelligent. Ms. Vance continued her speech, unaware of the new arrival. "Our students come from families that understand the value of excellence," she was saying, her voice carrying a hint of pride. "We maintain the highest standards in everything we do." The man at the back, Emma's father, raised an eyebrow slightly at this, but remained silent. His presence seemed to fill the room, though he hadn't moved from his spot by the door. Several parents were now whispering to each other, and Emma caught fragments of their conversations. "Isn't that? It couldn't be. What's he doing here?" Ms. Vance finally noticed the disruption and turned to see what had captured her audience's attention. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly as she took in the man's expensive suit and confident bearing. She faltered mid-sentence, something Emma had never seen before. "As I was saying," Ms. Vance continued, her voice slightly less assured, "we believe in showcasing the very best our students have to offer." Emma's father chose that moment to move forward, walking with quiet confidence to where Emma and Sophia sat. He placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, and she felt warmth spread through her chest at the simple gesture of claiming her as his. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, his voice rich and warm. "You've grown so much." Sophia stood to greet him, her composure perfect despite the surprise of the moment. They exchanged quiet words in Spanish, and Emma watched as her father's face softened with old familiarity. Ms. Vance was now visibly struggling to maintain the attention of her audience. Parents who had been nodding along to her speech were now casting curious glances toward Emma's corner of the room. The whispers had grown more intense. "That's Miguel Garcia, the tech investor? I read about him in Forbes." Emma watched as Ms. Vance's face cycled through emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as she began to piece things together. The teacher's eyes darted between Emma and her father, noting their shared features, the way he stood protectively near her desk. "And now," Ms. Vance said, her voice slightly higher than usual, "we'll hear from some of our outstanding students. Sarah Peterson has prepared a wonderful presentation about our solar system." As Sarah made her way to the front of the room, Emma felt her father lean down close to her ear. "Your mother tells me you did a presentation on Dolores Huerta," he whispered. "I'd love to hear about it later." Emma nodded, fighting back tears. He'd known about her presentation. He'd asked about her work. All this time, while she'd felt so alone, he'd been paying attention from afar. The rest of the presentations passed in a blur. Emma barely registered the other students speaking about their projects, too aware of her father's steady presence beside her, of the way other parents kept glancing their way, of how Ms. Vance seemed to be getting more flustered by the minute. When the formal presentations ended, parents began moving around the room to examine the display boards and talk with the teacher. Emma's father stood up, straightening his suit jacket with a casual elegance that made several nearby parents step back to give him space. "Shall we look at these excellent displays?" he suggested, offering his arm to Sophia in a gesture that spoke of old courtesies remembered. Emma walked between them, feeling for the first time like she truly belonged in this room. They stopped at each display board, her father asking thoughtful questions about the work shown. When they reached the last board, he turned to Ms. Vance, who had been hovering nearby trying to catch his attention. "I notice my daughter's work isn't displayed," he said pleasantly, but Emma could hear the steel beneath his polite tone. "I'd very much like to see it. Emma's mother tells me she's quite accomplished." Ms. Vance's face flushed. "Oh, well, we had limited space, and we had to be very selective." She was babbling now, something Emma had never seen before. "But of course, Miss Garcia has shown improvement." "Improvement," her father repeated, raising an eyebrow. "From what I understand, she's maintained straight A's despite having to work independently quite often. That seems more than merely improved." The silence that followed was deafening. Other parents had stopped their conversations to listen, and Emma saw Sarah's father watching with particular interest. "I didn't," Ms. Vance started, then stopped, seeming to realize there was no good way to finish that sentence. Perhaps I should review my selection criteria for future events. Emma's father smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps you should. He turned to Emma, his expression warming. Now, Mihija, why don't you tell me about your history project? I'm particularly interested in how you handled the section about civil rights. As Emma began to explain her work, she noticed something had shifted in the room. Parents who had previously ignored her were now listening intently. Ms. Vance stood frozen, her face a mask of poorly concealed dismay. And through it all, her father listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he'd done his own research on the topic. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted dramatically. Ms. Vance stood at her desk, shuffling papers with trembling hands, her usual composure cracking like thin ice. Every few seconds, her eyes would dart to where Emma stood with her parents, then quickly look away when she caught Miguel Garcia's steady gaze. The other parents had formed small groups, their whispered conversations punctuated by glances in Emma's direction. The same people who had previously overlooked her now seemed desperate to catch her eye, offering small waves and encouraging smiles. Sarah's father had even made his way over to compliment Emma's history presentation, which he'd overheard her discussing with her father. Dolores Huerta? Fascinating choice, he said, nodding appreciatively. Sarah mentioned your presentation was quite impressive. Didn't she, honey? He turned to his daughter, who stood nervously beside him. Sarah, caught between her usual friendly instincts and months of following Ms. Vance's lead, managed a small smile. Yeah, it was really good. I learned a lot about workers' rights. Ms. Vance cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of her carefully planned event. Perhaps we should move on to the individual progress reviews, she announced, her voice lacking its usual authority. I've prepared detailed assessments of each student's performance. She began calling parents up one by one, but her rhythm was off. The confident instructor who had commanded the room just hours ago was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to second-guess her every word. When she praised other students' work, her voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if she was suddenly aware of how her evaluations might be perceived. Emma watched as her father checked his phone, nodding slightly at whatever he saw there. Interesting, he murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. The Board of Trustees seems quite active in the parents' messaging group today. Ms. Vance's head snapped up at this, her face paling slightly. She fumbled with the papers in her hands, dropping several onto the floor. As she bent to retrieve them, Emma noticed how her perfectly styled hair had begun to fall out of place, how her confident posture had developed a slight stoop. When it came time for Emma's review, Ms. Vance seemed to age years in moments. She called them up with a voice that barely carried across the room, nothing like her usual commanding tone. Miss Garcia's performance. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard. That is to say, Emma has shown. She glanced at Miguel Garcia, who watched her with calm intensity. Emma has consistently demonstrated exceptional academic ability. The words seemed to pain her physically. Every compliment felt dragged out, each positive note delivered like a confession. Emma sat between her parents, hardly recognizing this version of the teacher who had made her feel so small for so long. Her work often exceeds expectations, Ms. Vance continued, shuffling through papers with shaking hands. Her recent history project, in particular, showed remarkable insight and thorough research. Sophia reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. They both knew this wasn't the same project Ms. Vance had dismissed just weeks ago, though nothing about the work itself had changed. In fact, Ms. Vance added, her voice growing higher with anxiety, I was just telling the other teachers how impressed I've been with Emma's contributions to class discussions. The lie hung in the air like smoke. Everyone who had witnessed Ms. Vance systematically ignore Emma's raised hand, day after day, knew the truth. Emma's father shifted slightly in his chair, and Ms. Vance flinched, as if he had shouted. Though perhaps, he said quietly, those contributions might have been even more valuable if they'd been encouraged more consistently. The room fell silent. Other parents stopped their whispered conversations to watch. Ms. Vance's face flushed deep red, then drained of all color. That is, of course. She stammered, her carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. There may have been some oversights in my teaching approach. The rest of the review passed in a blur of backtracking and nervous praising. Ms. Vance seemed to dig herself deeper with every attempt to cover her previous behavior, each word making it more obvious how she had treated Emma throughout the term. Other parents began exchanging uncomfortable glances, perhaps remembering times they had witnessed Ms. Vance's subtle cruelty and said nothing. A few looked genuinely ashamed, especially those whose children had followed the teacher's lead in excluding Emma. When the review finally ended, Ms. Vance quickly called the next family, clearly eager to move on. But before Emma and her parents could return to their seats, her father spoke again. "One moment, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I believe we should discuss Emma's future participation in class activities." Ms. Vance froze, her next set of review papers halfway to her desk. "Of course," she managed, sinking back into her chair. "I want to ensure that moving forward, Emma has the same opportunities as every other student," he continued. "No more independent work when others are in groups. No more overlooked contributions. No more comments about her shoes or her background. Do we understand each other?" Each word hit like a precise hammer stroke, nailing down every instance of discrimination Emma had faced. Ms. Vance seemed to shrink with each point, her usual imposing presence reduced to something small and uncertain. "Absolutely," she whispered. "I can assure you, Mr. Garcia, that Emma will receive every opportunity. The opportunities she should have had from the start," Sophia added, her quiet dignity a sharp contrast to Ms. Vance's crumbling composure. Around them, the classroom had gone completely silent. Every parent, every student watched as the balance of power shifted. Ms. Vance, who had wielded her authority like a weapon, now sat defenseless as her actions were laid bare. "I trust," Emma's father concluded, "that the board will be pleased to hear about these positive changes in approach." He smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "They take great interest in ensuring every student at Riverside Prep receives an equal chance to excel." Ms. Vance managed a weak nod, understanding the implicit warning in his words. Her hands shook as she reached for her water glass, nearly knocking it over. As they walked back to their seats, Emma caught sight of Sarah, who gave her a genuine smile. Not the secret ones from before, but an open gesture of friendship. Other students were looking at her differently too, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The remainder of Parents' Day passed in a haze of shifted perspectives and realigned relationships. Ms. Vance stumbled through the rest of her reviews, her confidence shattered, her authority diminished. Every time she praised another student's work, she glanced nervously at Emma's father, as if worried he might question her criteria. As Parents' Day drew to a close, families began gathering their things and saying their goodbyes. The classroom buzzed with conversation, but it wasn't the same confident social chatter from earlier. Parents spoke in hushed tones, stealing glances at Ms. Vance, who stood stiffly by her desk, attempting to maintain what little dignity she had left. Emma watched as her father checked his watch and nodded to Sophia. "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation with Ms. Vance," he said quietly. "Emma, would you mind waiting outside with your mother for a few minutes?" Emma felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Part of her wanted to stay, to witness whatever was about to happen, but she nodded and followed her mother toward the door. As they left, she saw her father approach Ms. Vance's desk with measured steps. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice carrying that same gentle but firm tone he'd used earlier. "Might I have a moment of your time?" The remaining parents quickly gathered their belongings and hurried out, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Even Sarah's father, who had been lingering to talk about the school board, made a swift exit. In the hallway, Emma sat with her mother on a wooden bench, the same bench where she'd eaten lunch alone countless times, not wanting to face the cafeteria. Now it felt different somehow, like she was seeing everything through new eyes. "Your father," Sophia said softly, "he may not have been here every day, but he has his own way of fighting for what matters." She squeezed Emma's hand. "Just like you." Through the classroom window, Emma could see her father standing tall and straight, his presence filling the room even as Ms. Vance seemed to shrink behind her desk. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read the body language clearly enough. Inside the classroom, Miguel Garcia stood calmly before Ms. Vance's desk, his expression neutral, but his eyes intense. Ms. Vance had taken her seat, perhaps hoping the familiar position of authority would provide some comfort. It didn't seem to be working. "Ms. Vance," he began, pulling up a chair and sitting down to level the playing field. "I'd like to discuss the environment you've created in your classroom." She shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting with a pen. "Mr. Garcia, I assure you that any misunderstandings—" "Let's not call them misunderstandings," he interrupted smoothly. "That would suggest some lack of intent on your part. We both know that's not the case." Ms. Vance's face flushed. She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, seeming to realize there was no defense she could offer. "I've read every email my daughter has sent her mother about this class," he continued. "Every detail about being excluded from group work, every cutting remark about her clothes, every raised hand you ignored." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've also reviewed her assignments, the ones you chose not to display today, despite their excellent quality." The pen in Ms. Vance's hands trembled slightly. "Mr. Garcia, please understand, our standards here at Riverside are meant to encourage excellence, not enforce social hierarchies," he finished for her. His voice remained calm, but each word carried weight. "Tell me, Ms. Vance, what exactly about my daughter's background made you decide she didn't belong here?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Ms. Vance's face had gone pale, her usual composure completely shattered. She looked around the room as if seeking escape, but found none. "I never—" Ms. Vance started, then stopped, perhaps realizing how hollow her denials would sound. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked genuinely ashamed. "I made assumptions," she admitted quietly. "I looked at her clothes, her lunch bag, her mother's job, and I judged." Miguel nodded slowly. "Yes, you did. You judged a child based on circumstances beyond her control. You used your position to make her feel unwelcome, unworthy." His voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. "You encouraged other students to exclude her. You ignored her achievements. You tried to break her spirit." Ms. Vance's hands were shaking so badly now that she had to put the pen down. "I didn't realize," she began, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "You did realize. Every time you saw her face fall, when you ignored her raised hand. Every time you watched her eat lunch alone. Every time you made those little remarks about her shoes or her clothes." He leaned forward slightly. "You realized, Ms. Vance. You just didn't care." Tears began to form in Ms. Vance's eyes. All her carefully constructed authority, her years of wielding influence through subtle cruelty, came crashing down around her. What are you going to do?" she whispered. Miguel sat back, studying her for a long moment. "That depends on you," he said finally. "I could speak to the board about creating a more inclusive environment at Riverside Prep. I could share my concerns about discriminatory practices in certain classrooms. I could suggest a review of teaching methods and student treatment." Each suggestion made Ms. Vance flinch. They both knew what any of those actions would mean for her career. "Or," he continued, his voice softening slightly, "you could choose to change. To truly understand what you've done wrong and work to fix it. Not just with Emma, but with any student who doesn't fit your preconceived notion of who belongs here." Ms. Vance looked up, hope flickering across her face. "I could do that," she said quickly. "I will do that." "Good," Miguel nodded. "Because I'll be watching. Not just me. The board will be paying close attention to how you handle diversity and inclusion in your classroom. They're quite interested in ensuring Riverside Prep lives up to its stated values." He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. "My daughter is a remarkable young woman, Ms. Vance. She has shown more strength and dignity in the face of your behavior than many adults would have. She deserves better. Every student deserves better." As he turned to leave, Ms. Vance called out softly, "Mr. Garcia?" He paused, looking back. "I truly am sorry." He studied her for a moment. "Prove it," he said simply, then walked out of the classroom, leaving Ms. Vance alone with the weight of her mistakes. The morning after Parents' Day felt different from the moment Emma walked into the classroom. The air itself seemed changed, as if someone had opened a window and let out years of stagnant prejudice. Students who normally rushed to their usual cliques now moved more cautiously, watching each other with uncertain eyes. Ms. Vance wasn't at her desk yet, which was unusual. She had always made it a point to arrive before anyone else, to stand guard at the front of the room like a sentinel. Her absence felt significant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Emma made her way to her usual seat, noticing how other students' eyes followed her movement. There were no snickers today, no whispered comments about her shoes or her backpack. Instead, she caught several small smiles, tentative but genuine. Sarah was the first to break the invisible barrier. She walked over to Emma's desk, clutching her books to her chest like a shield. "Hey," she said softly. "Is this seat taken?" She gestured to the empty desk next to Emma's. For a moment, Emma didn't know how to respond. After months of careful distance, this simple gesture felt enormous. "No," she finally managed. "It's free." As Sarah settled into the desk, other students began to drift closer. The invisible wall that had separated Emma from her classmates started to crack. Nobody mentioned yesterday directly, but its impact rippled through every interaction. When Ms. Vance finally entered the room, she looked different. Her usual perfectly pressed outfit seemed slightly rumpled, her hair not quite as meticulously styled. But the biggest change was in her eyes. The sharp, judgmental glint was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. She walked to Emma's desk before class began, her steps hesitant. The room fell silent, everyone watching this unprecedented moment. "Emma," she said softly, her voice carrying in the quiet classroom. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Emma followed Ms. Vance to the front of the room, aware of every eye tracking their movement. Her heart was pounding, but she held her head high, just as her father had yesterday. "I owe you an apology," Ms. Vance began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to cost her something, each syllable a small surrender. "My behavior has been unacceptable." Emma stood quietly, letting the moment stretch. Part of her wanted to make it easier for Ms. Vance, to quickly accept the apology and move on. But she thought of her father's quiet strength, her mother's daily dignity, and she waited. "I've treated you unfairly," Ms. Vance continued, her voice growing stronger with each admission. "I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with your abilities or your character. I was wrong." The classroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. Every student seemed to be holding their breath, witnessing something they'd never seen before, Ms. Vance admitting she was wrong. "You've shown remarkable resilience," she added, meeting Emma's eyes for the first time. "And exceptional academic ability. Your work deserves to be recognized, just like anyone else's." Emma nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said simply. She could have said more, about the lonely lunches, the ignored raised hands, the cutting remarks. But she saw the understanding in Ms. Vance's eyes and knew those words weren't necessary. As Emma returned to her seat, Ms. Vance addressed the whole class. "I believe we need to make some changes," she announced, her voice carrying a new note of sincerity. "Starting today, we're going to do things differently." She began rearranging the seating chart, mixing up the usual social groups. For the first time, no one was left out or pushed to the margins. When it came time for group work, she made sure the teams were balanced, giving everyone a chance to contribute. Throughout the day, Emma watched Ms. Vance struggle with her new approach. Sometimes the old habits would surface, a slight eye roll, a dismissive tone, but each time, Ms. Vance would catch herself, visibly correcting her behavior. During class discussions, she made a point of calling on everyone, not just her usual favorites. When Emma raised her hand to answer a question about the Civil War, Ms. Vance nodded encouragingly. "Excellent point, Emma. Would you like to expand on that?" The other students seemed to take their cues from this new dynamic. The invisible lines that had divided the class began to blur. During lunch, Sarah invited Emma to join her table, and others followed suit. The cafeteria no longer felt like a battlefield of social hierarchies. Mrs. Chun, passing through the cafeteria, stopped to smile at Emma. "I might miss our library lunches," she said warmly, "but this looks like a nicer way to eat." Emma smiled back, realizing she might miss those quiet moments too, but appreciating the change they represented. "I'll still come visit," she promised. "There are so many books I haven't read yet." After lunch, during history class, Ms. Vance did something unprecedented. She pulled out Emma's Dolores Huerta project and displayed it alongside the other students' work. "I believe we could all learn something from this presentation," she said, her voice carrying no trace of its former condescension. As Emma watched her work being properly acknowledged, she felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a kind of sadness for the months of struggle it had taken to reach this point. She thought about her father's words to Ms. Vance, about proving her remorse through actions. The day ended with Ms. Vance handing out assignments for a new group project. When she announced the teams, Emma found herself paired with Sarah and two other students who had previously kept their distance. There was no hesitation this time, no awkward glances or mumbled excuses. As they gathered their things to leave, Sarah turned to Emma. "Want to come over this weekend to work on the project? My mom asked if you'd like to stay for dinner too." Emma smiled, feeling the last bits of her old isolation crumbling away. "I'd like that," she said. "Let me check with my mom." Walking home that afternoon, Emma thought about how much had changed in just 2 days. Her father's brief presence had somehow shifted the entire world of her classroom. But it wasn't just his influence. It was the strength she'd shown all along, the dignity she'd maintained even when it felt impossible. The weeks following Parents' Day brought changes that rippled through Emma's life like waves on a pond. Each day seemed to bring a new shift, small but significant, in how she experienced school and how others treated her. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, like watching a garden grow. Ms. Vance's classroom slowly evolved into a different kind of space. The invisible barriers that had divided students based on their backgrounds began to dissolve. During group discussions, voices that had been silent before started to speak up. Emma noticed how Ms. Vance would catch herself when old habits surfaced, how she'd pause and redirect her reactions into something more inclusive. One morning, a new student arrived, a boy named Marcus whose clothes were as worn as Emma's had been that first day. She watched Ms. Vance closely, seeing how the teacher hesitated for just a moment before warmly welcoming him. When it came time for group work, Ms. Vance looked directly at Emma before announcing, "Marcus, why don't you join Emma's group? They're some of our strongest students." The pride in those words, so different from the dismissive tone of just weeks ago, made Emma's chest warm. She moved her desk to make room for Marcus, remembering how it felt to be the outsider. "Hey," she said with a genuine smile. "Don't worry if the work seems tough at first. We help each other here." Sarah, now a constant presence at Emma's side, nodded in agreement. "Emma's the best at explaining things," she added, then grinned. "And I bring snacks, so between us, you're covered." At lunch, their table had grown from just Emma and Sarah to include a mix of students from different backgrounds. Even some of the kids who had once followed Ms. Vance's lead in excluding Emma now sat with them, their previous behavior unmentioned but not entirely forgotten. Emma's father kept his word about staying involved, though not in the way some might have expected. He didn't show up at school again, but his presence was felt in other ways. Weekly phone calls became part of Emma's routine, and she found herself sharing not just her achievements, but also her everyday experiences. "How's the new group project going?" he'd ask, genuinely interested in the details. "Really good," Emma would tell him, curled up on the couch while her mother cooked dinner. "Sarah and I are leading the research part, and Marcus is amazing at making the presentations look professional." He never directly mentioned his confrontation with Ms. Vance, but sometimes he'd ask subtle questions about how things were in class. Emma knew he was still watching, still making sure the changes stuck. Sophia noticed the changes in her daughter too. Emma walked differently now, held herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The morning routine of checking her uniform and worrying about her shoes had transformed into something more relaxed, more natural. "You remind me of your father," Sophia said one morning, watching Emma gather her books. "Not just how you look, but how you carry yourself. Like you know exactly who you are." Emma thought about that as she walked to school. She did feel different, but not because of any external changes. The difference was inside, in how she saw herself and her place in the world. The struggle hadn't broken her. It had revealed her strength. In class, her raised hand was now just one among many, but it still went up without hesitation. When Ms. Vance called on her, there was no more surprise in her voice, no subtle dismissal. Instead, there was a new kind of respect, earned through resilience rather than privilege. As the school year progressed, Emma found herself becoming a bridge between different groups of students. Those who felt out of place would gravitate toward her, perhaps sensing that she understood their struggle. She helped them navigate the unwritten rules of Riverside Prep while showing them they didn't have to lose themselves to fit in. Mrs. Chen still saved books for her, though Emma's library visits were now more about love of reading than escape. "You've started quite a revolution," the librarian said one day, watching as Emma and her diverse group of friends discussed their latest reading assignment. "Not a revolution," Emma replied thoughtfully. "Just a reminder that everyone deserves a chance to be heard." The changes weren't limited to school. At home, Emma noticed how her mother stood taller during parent meetings, no longer apologizing for her work clothes or accent. Sophia spoke up more during discussions with teachers, her quiet dignity matching her daughter's growing confidence. Emma's father remained a steady presence in her life, though still mostly from a distance. His influence was felt in subtle ways: a new laptop for schoolwork, regular checks on her progress, proud messages shared with Sophia about Emma's achievements. But more importantly, he had shown her that standing up for yourself didn't always mean making noise. Sometimes it was about quiet strength, about maintaining your dignity until others were forced to see their own prejudice. Near the end of the year, Ms. Vance asked Emma to stay after class. The request no longer filled her with dread. Instead, she felt curious, confident in her ability to handle whatever came next. "I've been thinking," Ms. Vance said, her manner different from the commanding presence she'd once been. "Next year, we're starting a peer mentoring program. Students helping other students adjust tea. Oh, Riverside Prep. Would you be interested in leading it?" Emma thought about all the moments she'd felt lost and alone, about how different things might have been if someone had reached out to her. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." As she walked home that afternoon, Emma reflected on how far she'd come from that first nervous day. The school buildings hadn't changed, the uniforms were the same, even most of the faces were familiar. But everything felt different, because she was different. She had learned that belonging wasn't about fitting into someone else's mold. It was about being strong enough to be yourself until the mold changed to accommodate you. Her father's brief appearance had catalyzed the change, but the strength had been within her all along, passed down through her mother's quiet perseverance and her father's dignified resistance. Emma Garcia was still an unassuming girl with large brown eyes and a quiet demeanor. But now she understood that these weren't limitations. They were part of who she was. And who she was, she had learned, was more than enough. The sun was setting as she reached her apartment building, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Through the window, she could see her mother moving around their small kitchen, probably starting dinner. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah about their weekend plans, and another from her father asking about her day. Emma smiled, feeling the warmth of belonging, not because she had changed to fit in, but because she had stayed true to herself until the world around her learned to see her worth. That, she realized, was the greatest lesson of all.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.